After the First World War, the geopolitical order of Central Europe shifted dramatically. The Treaty of Versailles restored Poland to the map after more than a century of partitions, but it also created long-term tensions with Germany. The so-called Polish Corridor and the status of Danzig became recurring disputes. In Berlin, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the consolidation of Nazi rule in the 1930s turned these disputes into central elements of German foreign policy. Hitler's program of expansion included the destruction of Poland as an independent state, not only to recover lost territories, but also to secure strategic depth for the planned conflict with France and Britain. By the summer of 1939, relations between the two countries had collapsed. Germany demanded concessions, including a corridor through Polish territory and the return of Danzig. Warsaw, supported by diplomatic guarantees from Britain and France, rejected these demands, recognizing that further concessions would undermine sovereignty. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 sealed Poland's fate. The secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, granting Germany freedom to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded from the west, north, and south, initiating the Second World War in Europe. Poland's military position at the outbreak of war was precarious. The Polish army, though capable and numerous on paper, with about 1 million men mobilized, was hindered by outdated equipment, slow mobilization, and dispersed deployment. Armored forces consisted largely of light tanks and tankettes, with fewer than 600 modern armored vehicles in service. The Air Force was heavily outnumbered, with around 400 modern aircraft facing more than 2,000 German planes. The defensive strategy, known as Plan West, called for defending Poland's extensive borders, leaving units spread thin and vulnerable to concentrated German assaults. Germany's invasion plan, Fall Weiss, relied on speed and encirclement. Army Group North advanced from East Prussia and Pomerania. Army Group South pushed from Silesia and Slovakia, while Army Group Center drove directly toward Warsaw. Blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized the rapid use of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air power in coordinated strikes, overwhelming defenders before they could regroup. Within the first week, German forces achieved deep penetrations, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw and cutting off several Polish armies. The Polish armies of Poznan and Pomorze, commanded respectively by General Tadeusz Kutreba and General Władysław Bortnowski, occupied positions in western Poland at the beginning of hostilities. Initially, these forces saw little heavy fighting. German thrusts bypassed them, focusing instead on central sectors. By September 8th, the two armies remained relatively intact, numbering nearly 150,000 men. While many other Polish formations had already been encircled or destroyed, this unusual situation presented both a risk and an opportunity. If these forces remained passive, they would eventually be trapped in the German advance. If committed to action, they could strike at exposed German units operating along extended supply lines toward Warsaw. The mood among Polish commanders reflected both desperation and determination. Kutrzeba, a professional officer with experience in staff planning, recognized that his forces were positioned to launch a counterstroke. Bortnowski, commanding the Pomorze army, faced the reality that his units had been weakened by earlier clashes and disorganization during retreat. Nevertheless, the two armies together represented the largest intact Polish force left in the field. Their presence offered Warsaw the chance of relief and raised hopes that Poland might still alter the pace of the campaign. For the German side, early reports from the front suggested that the Polish army was collapsing rapidly. German propaganda emphasized constant victories and predicted the imminent fall of Warsaw. Yet the rapid pace of the offensive created vulnerabilities. Supply lines stretched thin across poorly developed roads, while infantry divisions lagged behind armored spearheads. The German Eighth Army, advancing near Łódź, became the immediate target for a potential Polish counteroffensive. Public sentiment in Poland reflected both alarm and resilience. Refugee flows clogged the roads as civilians fled advancing German columns and aerial bombardments. At the same time, many still hoped that the Western Allies, bound by treaty obligations, would soon launch a major offensive against Germany from the west. The French and British declarations of war on September 3rd gave temporary encouragement, though the lack of significant military action quickly became apparent. By the second week of September, the stage was set for the largest Polish counterattack of the campaign. The armies of Poznan and Pomorze, relatively intact and positioned along the Bzura River, prepared to strike at German forces whose attention was focused on Warsaw. What followed would become the Battle of Bzura, the largest engagement fought by Poland in 1939, and one that temporarily shifted the momentum of the campaign, even as the overall strategic balance remained decisively in Germany's favor. In the opening days of September 1939, German armored columns pushed deep into Polish territory. Following the doctrine of rapid breakthrough and encirclement, the German 10th Army advanced directly toward Warsaw through the Central Corridor, while the 8th Army moved on its northern flank, threatening to cut Polish units off from the capital. By 8th September, elements of German divisions were already at the outskirts of Warsaw, subjecting the city to bombardment and causing panic among civilians. The speed of this advance created the impression that Poland's defense was on the verge of collapse. Yet not all Polish armies had been destroyed or encircled. To the west, two sizable groups, the Poznan Army under General Tadeusz Kutrzeba and the Pomorze Army under General Władysław Bortnowski, remained intact. The Poznan Army had largely avoided heavy combat in the first week of fighting. Positioned in western Poland near the German border, it was initially bypassed by the main thrusts of Army Group South. General Kutrzeba had withdrawn his forces eastward in good order, preserving their cohesion. By early September, he commanded 4 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades, amounting to nearly 100,000 troops. Although these units were short of modern artillery and mechanization, they retained fighting capacity. Kutrzeba's staff officers recognized that their relative freedom of movement offered a rare chance to strike back. The Pomorze Army's condition was more precarious. Bortnowski's forces, initially positioned near the Vistula in the north, had suffered heavy losses during the retreat from Pomerania after German breakthroughs in the corridor region. By the time they reached the Bzura sector, they were diminished and exhausted, though still numbering approximately 50,000 men. Many of their units were disorganized, but when combined with Kutrzeba's better prepared formations, they significantly increased the strength of Polish forces in the area. The German 8th Army, under General Johannes Blaskowitz, had advanced toward Łódź and was moving northeast to support the main attack on Warsaw. Its divisions, including the 30th, 24th, and 10th Infantry, were spread across a wide area. Armored support was limited, as most of Germany's tank divisions were concentrated further south with the 10th Army. This deployment left the 8th Army temporarily vulnerable to a concentrated blow. Kutrzeba identified this weakness during reconnaissance and argued strongly for a counterattack to relieve pressure on Warsaw and disrupt German lines of communication. On September 7th, Kutrzeba presented his plan to the Polish High Command. He proposed a counteroffensive along the Bzura River, with the Poznan Army attacking southward into the flank of the 8th Army, while the Pomorze Army supported from the north. The goal was not to defeat the Germans outright, but to buy time, delay the encirclement of Warsaw, and allow other Polish armies in the south and east to regroup. The plan carried risks. Committing forces to the offensive could expose them to counterattack from superior German armored formations. Yet, with Warsaw under immediate threat, Kutrzeba concluded that action was preferable to passive retreat. High Command, led by Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, was hesitant at first but eventually authorized the move. Communications with Warsaw were already strained, and the broader situation across the country was deteriorating rapidly. Nevertheless, the potential to disrupt German momentum was judged worth the gamble. The order was given to prepare the counteroffensive for September 9th. In the villages and towns along the Bzura, civilians watched the buildup of Polish forces with mixed emotions. Some hoped that the concentration of troops signaled a chance to halt the German advance, while others feared that fighting in their region would bring devastation. Refugees from the west, already displaced by earlier battles, mingled with local populations, creating shortages of food and shelter. Farmers were required to supply horses and carts for military logistics, adding to the strain on rural communities. German command initially underestimated the danger. Confident in the success of Blitzkrieg and the rapid retreat of Polish units elsewhere, Błaszkowicz considered his flanks secure. German intelligence noted the presence of Polish forces west of the Vistula, but did not anticipate a major offensive action. The Luftwaffe continued to focus on Warsaw and key transportation nodes, leaving the Bzura sector with comparatively limited reconnaissance coverage. By the night of 8 September, Polish units were in position. Infantry divisions moved quietly through the countryside, while cavalry brigades prepared to launch mobile attacks once the battle began. Artillery was placed along concealed ridges, and engineers readied bridges for rapid crossings of the river. Despite shortages of equipment, morale was high among the troops, many of whom saw this as their first real opportunity to strike back after days of retreat and bombardment. The opening phase of the Battle of Bzura thus began not with fighting, but with the deliberate and carefully planned concentration of Polish forces. Against the backdrop of German advances elsewhere, Kutrzeba's decision marked a bold shift from defensive withdrawal to offensive action. Within hours, the largest Polish counterattack of the campaign would begin, testing both sides' ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions on the battlefield. The planning that led to the Battle of Bzura reflected both the constraints of the Polish position and the fleeting opportunities still available in the second week of September 1939. At the strategic level, the German invasion had achieved rapid successes, with armored spearheads penetrating deep into central Poland. Warsaw was already threatened, and several Polish armies in the west and south were encircled or in retreat. Yet the Poznan and Pomorze armies remained relatively cohesive. Their survival provided the Polish command with one of the last chances to mount an organized counteroffensive during the campaign. General Tadeusz Kutrzeba, commanding the Poznan army, had long favored a more active strategy. Trained as a staff officer and familiar with modern doctrines, he understood the dangers of passivity when facing a mobile enemy. As his units withdrew eastward during the first week of the invasion, he resisted pressure to engage prematurely, preserving his forces until a suitable opportunity emerged. By September 7th, his army included the 14th, 17th, 25th, and 26th Infantry Divisions, supported by the Wielkopolska and Podolska cavalry brigades. These formations, numbering nearly 100,000 men, were short on heavy weapons, but remained disciplined and combat effective. The Pomorze army under General Władysław Bortnowski was in a weaker state. It had been battered during the retreat from Pomerania and the battles of Grudziądz and Tuczola Forest. Its units, including the 4th, 9th, 15th, and 16th Infantry Divisions, along with cavalry brigades, suffered losses and disorganization. Yet, even reduced, the army contributed roughly 50,000 men to the potential counterattack. When combined with Kutrzeba's force, this gave the Poles a concentration of approximately 150,000 troops, supported by around 300 artillery pieces and a few dozen light tanks and armored cars. In comparison to German panzer divisions, Polish armored assets were negligible, but in infantry strength, they represented a formidable concentration. The chosen target for the counteroffensive was the German 8th Army under General Johannes Błaszkowicz. This formation, positioned between Łódź and Warsaw, was advancing northeast to support the main thrust of the 10th Army. Its divisions included the 30th Infantry Division, the 24th Infantry Division, and others stretched across a broad front. Crucially, the 8th Army lacked strong armored support, as most German tanks were committed to the 10th Army's push toward Warsaw. This imbalance offered a window for Kutrzeba. Striking into the exposed flank of the 8th Army could disrupt German lines of communication, force a withdrawal, and relieve pressure on the capital. This Polish planning reflected several goals. First, the immediate objective was to disrupt the German advance by forcing Błaszkowicz's troops to defend themselves rather than support operations around Warsaw. Second, a successful offensive might allow Polish forces to link with the Łódź army, which was retreating eastward in disarray, and create a larger grouping capable of continued resistance. Third, Kutrzeba hoped that prolonging the fight would give the Allies, Britain and France, more time to intervene decisively on the Western Front. Though no major Allied offensive had yet materialized, Polish leaders still counted on their commitments. The plan envisioned a two-pronged assault beginning on September 9th. The Poznan army would launch the main attack southward from the line of the Bzura River toward Łęczyca, targeting the 30th Infantry Division. The Pomor's army would support by advancing from the north and tying down German units. Cavalry brigades would exploit breakthroughs, while infantry divisions would press the main assault. Artillery was concentrated to deliver supporting fire, though shortages of ammunition meant barrages would be limited. Engineers prepared pontoon bridges and crossings to enable movement across the Bzura. German strategic aims contrasted sharply. The overall plan, Fall Weiss, sought to encircle and destroy Polish forces west of the Vistula before they could regroup. The 10th Army's armored divisions were already driving toward Warsaw, aiming to capture the capital quickly and split the country. The 8th Army's role was to cover the flank and secure communications. German commanders believed that Polish forces in the west were retreating too rapidly to mount a serious counteroffensive. Intelligence underestimated the scale of the Polish concentration along the Bzura, and reconnaissance flights focused primarily on the approaches to Warsaw. This miscalculation set the stage for the surprise of September 9th. Logistics played a central role in shaping both sides' expectations. The Germans enjoyed the advantage of motorization, enabling rapid redeployment of troops and supplies. Their forces relied on long supply lines stretching back into Silesia and central Germany, but these were secured by efficient staff coordination. The Poles, by contrast, moved primarily on foot or with horse-drawn transport. Supply convoys were vulnerable to air attack, and shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were chronic. Kuturzeba was acutely aware that his counteroffensive could not be sustained indefinitely. It was designed as a sharp blow, not a prolonged campaign. Propaganda also influenced perceptions. German media continued to present the invasion as a series of uninterrupted victories, highlighting the rapid approach to Warsaw. Within Poland, government announcements stressed resistance and pointed to the concentration of forces near the Bzura as evidence that the struggle was not yet lost. Soldiers preparing for the counteroffensive were told that their attack could save Warsaw, strengthen national morale, and prove that Poland was still capable of taking the initiative. In retrospect, both sides made significant miscalculations. The Poles underestimated the speed with which German reinforcements, including panzer divisions and Luftwaffe units, could be redirected to the threatened sector. The Germans, conversely, underestimated Polish offensive capability and were caught off guard by the scale of the counterattack. This clash of expectations would define the opening battles of the Bzura offensive, producing the largest single engagement of the September campaign and temporarily shifting the dynamics of the war. As night fell on the 8th of September, Polish troops took their positions along the river, preparing for the assault at dawn. Infantry formed up in woods and villages. Cavalry brigades stood ready to charge into the open plains, and artillery officers calculated firing ranges against German strongpoints. Across the battlefield, German divisions rested, largely unaware of the storm that was about to break. The stage was set for Poland's largest counteroffensive of 1939, one that would surprise the Wehrmacht and alter the course of the campaign, if only briefly. At dawn on September 9th, 1939, the counteroffensive along the Bzura River began. After a week of retreat and bombardment, Polish forces finally went on the attack. The Poznan army struck first, with the 14th and 25th Infantry Divisions, advancing southward from the line of the Bzura toward the town of Łęczyca. Supporting them on the flanks were cavalry brigades, the Wielkopolska and Podolska, whose mobility allowed them to exploit gaps in the German front. Artillery, although limited in ammunition, opened fire on German positions, surprising defenders who had not anticipated a large-scale assault in this sector. The initial clashes caught the German 30th Infantry Division unprepared. Expecting only scattered resistance from retreating Polish units, German officers were surprised by the concentration and determination of the attack. Polish infantry pressed forward across open ground, supported by cavalry charges that disrupted German defensive lines. By midday, Polish forces had broken through in several places, forcing the Germans to retreat toward Łęczyca. The town itself changed hands after heavy fighting, with Polish troops capturing it by evening. The momentum of the first day was firmly in Poland's favor, and morale among Kutzeba's soldiers surged. In other sectors, the Pomor's army joined the offensive. Although weakened by earlier retreats, its 16th Infantry Division and Pomeranian Cavalry Brigade advanced southward, tying down additional German units. The combination of two armies striking together created a front nearly 25 kilometers wide, stretching from the Bzura toward Wołycz. German formations, initially dispersed along extended lines of communication, were forced into rapid redeployment. Reports from the 8th Army to higher headquarters acknowledged that Polish forces had achieved a dangerous breakthrough, threatening supply routes to the 10th Army, which was pressing toward Warsaw. For civilians in the region, the sudden shift in the battle was dramatic. Villages that had endured German occupation for a few days now saw Polish troops re-entering, often greeted with relief by locals who hoped the offensive might turn the tide of the war. Yet this resurgence came at a heavy cost. Fields and settlements became battle zones, subjected to artillery barrages, house-to-house fighting, and German counterfire. Refugee flows intensified, with civilians caught between retreating Germans and advancing Poles. Casualty lists grew quickly, and infrastructure was destroyed in the crossfire. German commanders reacted quickly once the scale of the attack became clear. Blaskowitz requested reinforcements from the 10th Army, which diverted armored elements to stabilize the situation. Orders were issued to regroup the 24th Infantry Division and commit reserves to counter the Polish thrust. At the same time, the Luftwaffe was redirected from Warsaw to the Bzura sector. Stuka dive bombers began striking Polish troop concentrations, bridges, and artillery batteries, inflicting heavy losses and slowing the advance. This immediate air response illustrated one of the key German advantages: the ability to concentrate air power rapidly at decisive points. Despite growing pressure, Polish units pressed on through September 10th. The 17th Infantry Division attacked Skierniewice, while cavalry brigades maneuvered around the German flanks, raiding supply convoys and disrupting communications. By this point, the counteroffensive had gained approximately 30 kilometers of ground and inflicted significant casualties on German units. For the first time in the campaign, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture on a major sector of the front. Reports from German officers noted confusion, with some formations retreating in disorder before regrouping. The Polish High Command in Warsaw viewed the news with cautious optimism. The counterattack relieved immediate pressure on the capital, forcing German units to divert attention away from the siege. There was hope that the offensive might allow other Polish armies retreating from the south to regroup and join the fight. Yet, Marshal Radziwiłł hesitated to commit additional reserves, fearing that German armored divisions elsewhere would still deliver decisive blows. The counteroffensive thus remained limited to the resources of Kutrzeba and Bortnowski without large-scale reinforcement. As the battle intensified, the limitations of the Polish position became clearer. Logistics were a constant challenge. Supply convoys moved slowly on horse-drawn carts, vulnerable to Luftwaffe attacks. Ammunition stocks were insufficient for prolonged artillery barrages. Communications relied on couriers and field telephones that were often cut by bombardments. German units, though temporarily disorganized, were better supported by mechanized transport and radio coordination, enabling faster regrouping once reinforcements arrived. The fighting also revealed contrasting doctrines. The Polish offensive relied heavily on infantry massed in frontal assaults, supported by cavalry and limited artillery. These tactics achieved early success against German infantry divisions, but were vulnerable once armored reinforcements and air power intervened. German doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, and once panzer units entered the battle, they quickly began to blunt Polish momentum. By 11 September, the initial shock of the counterattack had faded. German reinforcements stabilized the front, and the Luftwaffe inflicted mounting casualties. Yet, Polish gains remained real. Several towns and villages had been recaptured, thousands of German prisoners taken, and the 8th Army forced to fight defensively for the first time in the campaign. For Polish soldiers and civilians alike, these opening engagements demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Still, the cost was already heavy. Polish units had suffered thousands of casualties. Artillery was running low on shells, and the Germans were clearly preparing for countermeasures on a larger scale. The first phase of the Battle of Bzura, marked by surprise and success, gave way to a broader and bloodier struggle. What had begun as a bold counterstroke now escalated into the largest engagement of the September campaign, one that would test both armies under increasingly desperate conditions. The escalation of the Battle of Bzura unfolded rapidly after the initial Polish successes of September 9th to 10th, 1939. What had begun as a surprise counteroffensive soon developed into a major engagement involving nearly 200,000 men across a wide front. German High Command, alarmed by reports of serious setbacks to the Eighth Army, reacted by shifting significant reinforcements into the threatened sector. The result was a dramatic intensification of fighting that exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Polish plan. Polish forces, encouraged by their victories around Łęczyca and Piontek, attempted to expand the offensive further east toward Wołocz and Sochachev. The 17th Infantry Division advanced in the direction of Skierniewice, aiming to cut German supply routes and open a corridor toward Warsaw. Cavalry brigades operated aggressively on the flanks, raiding convoys and disrupting rear echelons. Kutrzeba and Bortnowski sought to maintain pressure, hoping to exploit German disorganization before reinforcements could arrive. For a brief period, the strategy appeared effective. German divisions fell back under pressure, and Polish troops captured prisoners, weapons, and supplies. Reports from the field described German infantry retreating in disorder, with some formations losing contact with their higher command. Yet these gains carried risks. The further Polish units advanced from their river crossings, the more stretched their supply lines became. Ammunition, already limited, began to run low. Food and medical supplies lagged behind the front line, and columns of horse-drawn carts proved easy targets for air raids. The Luftwaffe's intervention quickly changed the balance. Beginning on 11 September, large numbers of Stuka dive bombers and Heinkel bombers concentrated on the Bzura front. Bridges across the river were destroyed, isolating forward units from their reserves. Artillery batteries, once hidden in forests and villages, were systematically targeted and silenced. Polish infantry, advancing in daylight, found themselves exposed to relentless air attack. Casualties mounted not only from bombs and strafing, but also from the demoralizing effect of constant aerial pressure. Civilians in the region suffered as well, with towns such as Wołocz and Sochachev subjected to bombardments that killed non-combatants and forced mass evacuations. German ground reinforcements soon followed. The 10th Army diverted elements of its panzer divisions, including the 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions, to stabilize the situation. Motorized infantry brigades and additional artillery were brought in, creating a concentration of mechanized power the Poles could not match. Błaszkowicz reorganized his battered 8th Army, placing priority on sealing the Polish penetration and regaining the initiative. The German response illustrated the flexibility of their operational command structure, capable of redirecting forces quickly across multiple sectors. Polish commanders recognized the growing danger. Kutrzeba initially hoped to push further east, but as German reinforcements arrived, he realized that his armies risked encirclement if they remained on the offensive. By 12th September, he began considering withdrawal toward the Campinos Forest and Warsaw, where his forces might reinforce the capital's defense. However, executing this maneuver under German pressure was fraught with difficulty. The Bzura River, already swollen by late summer rains, became a formidable obstacle once bridges were destroyed. Thousands of Polish soldiers found themselves trapped on the western bank, fighting desperate holding actions against superior forces. The escalation phase also highlighted the severe challenges of Polish command and coordination. Communication between the Poznan and Pomorze armies was often delayed or disrupted by German bombardment. Field telephones were cut, and radio sets were scarce. Kutrzeba and Bortnowski struggled to maintain control over widely dispersed divisions. Orders frequently arrived late, forcing local commanders to act on their own initiative. In some cases, units advanced too far without support, becoming isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. For the Germans, the crisis of the first days of the counteroffensive gradually gave way to renewed confidence. By concentrating armor, artillery, and air power, they began to regain control of the battlefield. Encirclement tactics, hallmarks of blitzkrieg, were now applied in reverse against the Polish attackers. Rather than merely halting the offensive, German commanders sought to trap and annihilate the Polish armies west of the Vistula. The human toll grew rapidly. Polish losses by mid-September numbered tens of thousands killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties also rose sharply, particularly during the first days of the counteroffensive, when infantry divisions bore the brunt of Polish assaults. Estimates suggest that the Germans lost several thousand men during this phase, though precise figures remain disputed. For local civilians, the escalation meant near total devastation. Villages were burned, farmland churned by artillery, and entire communities uprooted as refugees streamed eastward. Internationally, the battle drew limited attention. Britain and France, though formally at war with Germany, launched only limited operations on the Western Front, the so-called Sitzkrieg. In Poland, expectations that Allied action might relieve pressure remained high. But as the Bzura fighting intensified, it became clear that no immediate assistance was coming. The counteroffensive was, in reality, Poland's effort to fight alone against overwhelming odds. By 13th September, the Battle of Bzura had escalated into the largest engagement of the September campaign. Nearly a third of the Polish army was involved, clashing with major German formations supported by the Luftwaffe. The initial Polish successes had been blunted, and the Wehrmacht was preparing to deliver a decisive response. What had begun as a bold attempt to alter the momentum of the war now risked becoming a struggle for survival. The crisis was clear. If Polish forces could not disengage and withdraw eastward, they faced the prospect of encirclement and destruction. By mid-September 1939, the Battle of Bzura reached its most intense phase. The Polish counteroffensive, which had begun with surprise and success, now faced the full weight of German retaliation. Between 14 and 16 September, fighting escalated into the largest operations of the campaign, involving concentrated assaults, desperate defenses, and the heavy use of armor and air power. Polish forces under Generals Kutrzeeba and Bortnowski pressed eastward, aiming to break through towards Sochachev and link up with Warsaw's defenders. The 25th and 17th Infantry Divisions, supported by cavalry brigades, launched determined attacks across the Bzura River. Their objective was to force a corridor to the capital, bringing much-needed reinforcements and buying time for the defense of Warsaw. Early gains were made around Sochachu, where German units were driven back temporarily, but the cost was high. German artillery and aircraft pounded advancing columns, slowing momentum and inflicting severe casualties. At the same time, German reinforcements poured into the battle. The 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions, supported by motorized infantry, executed counterattacks designed to cut off Polish advances. These formations, equipped with tanks and armored cars, exploited their mobility to outflank slower-moving Polish infantry. Combined with precision strikes by the Luftwaffe, these maneuvers steadily eroded Polish offensive capacity. Stuka dive bombers became a constant presence, targeting bridges, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The destruction of several key river crossings further isolated Polish units already east of the Bzura, leaving them vulnerable to encirclement. For soldiers on both sides, conditions were brutal. Polish infantry fought largely on foot, often in forested or marshy terrain, where visibility was limited and communication unreliable. Cavalry units launched repeated raids, sometimes against German armored columns, in attempts to delay advances. German panzer crews faced fierce resistance in close-quarter combat, where Polish anti-tank rifles and field guns could still be effective at short range. Casualties mounted rapidly, and both armies experienced moments of disorder as units were overextended or cut off. The civilian population of the Bzura region suffered acutely during this peak phase. Towns such as Sochachu and Wołycz became battlefields, with artillery reducing entire districts to ruins. Thousands of inhabitants fled eastward, adding to the growing wave of refugees converging on Warsaw. Roads clogged with civilians, retreating soldiers, and military supply convoys became easy targets for German air raids. Reports from the period describe widespread destruction of villages, livestock abandoned in fields, and entire communities displaced. Polish command attempted to reorganize during the peak of the fighting. Counterattack, recognizing that his initial offensive had stalled, issued orders for a gradual withdrawal toward the Campinos forest, with the aim of breaking through to Warsaw. However, coordinating such a maneuver under heavy enemy pressure was extremely difficult. Communications were disrupted, some units had already become encircled, and others were too exhausted to continue organized retreat. German command at this stage viewed the battle not merely as a defensive success, but as an opportunity to destroy two Polish armies outright. Orders from higher headquarters emphasized encirclement. Panzer units pushed to cut off escape routes to the east, while infantry divisions pressed from the west and south. Artillery fire was concentrated on river crossings, ensuring that retreat would be costly. The Luftwaffe, flying hundreds of sorties daily, played a central role in preventing regrouping or reorganization. Despite these challenges, Polish soldiers continued to resist fiercely during the peak of the campaign. At times, counterattack succeeded in recapturing villages or delaying panzer thrusts. In several engagements, cavalry brigades mounted charges against German positions, not as symbolic gestures but as desperate tactical actions intended to buy time for infantry withdrawal. These moments underscored the determination of Polish troops even in the face of overwhelming odds. By 16 September, however, the balance of the battle was clearly shifting. Polish forces had inflicted significant losses and forced the Wehrmacht into its most serious engagement of the campaign so far. But the cost had been immense. Entire divisions were reduced to fragments, supplies were nearly exhausted, and the Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies left little room for maneuver. The largest phase of the Battle of Bzura had passed its climax, and the outcome was becoming increasingly apparent. What remained was not the continuation of the offensive, but the struggle for survival and the desperate attempt to reach Warsaw before encirclement closed completely. As the Battle of Bzura moved past its climax, the character of the fighting shifted from bold offensive thrusts to desperate resistance and improvisation. By 17 September, the Polish armies that had struck with such force only days before were under mounting pressure from three sides. The Poznan and Pomor's armies, numbering together around 150,000 men at the start of the operation, now faced disintegration unless they could adapt quickly to the changing battlefield. Counterattack's decision to attempt withdrawal toward the Campinos forest was rooted in the recognition that remaining along the Bzura would only lead to annihilation. The plan was to disengage from German pressure, regroup in the wooded terrain north of Sochacho, and then push toward Warsaw to reinforce the capital's defenses. Yet implementing this plan demanded resilience under impossible conditions. The river crossings, vital lifelines for retreat, were heavily targeted by German artillery and bombers. Many bridges were destroyed, and makeshift fords across the swollen Bzura became killing grounds where soldiers and civilians alike suffered heavy losses. Polish units adapted as best they could. Cavalry brigades, once used for flanking maneuvers, now played a defensive role, shielding the retreat of infantry from panzer assaults. In forests and villages, improvised strong points were established, delaying German advances and buying time for stragglers to move eastward. Artillery, though nearly out of shells, was deployed in short, concentrated bursts to disrupt enemy armor before being abandoned or spiked. Infantry units carried out ambushes, using terrain to counter the mechanized superiority of their opponents. German tactics in this phase centered on exploitation of mobility. Panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry, raced to cut off retreat routes toward Warsaw. The 1st and 4th Panzer divisions encircled Sochachev and pressed northward, while the 2nd Motorized Division swung around from the south. The Luftwaffe maintained constant pressure, bombing columns on the move and strafing refugees who clogged the roads. For the German command, the goal was no longer simply to halt the Polish counteroffensive, but to crush two entire field armies and eliminate any possibility of a coordinated Polish defense. The psychological toll on Polish soldiers was immense. Units that had achieved victory only days earlier now found themselves isolated, running low on food, water, and ammunition. Morale fluctuated sharply. Some formations, like the 25th Infantry Division, managed to hold cohesion and conduct organized withdrawals under fire. Others disintegrated under pressure, with soldiers abandoning heavy equipment and attempting to reach Warsaw in small groups. The knowledge that Soviet forces had crossed Poland's eastern frontier on September 17th only deepened the sense of encirclement, though news of this invasion did not reach every unit in real time. Civilians in the path of the retreat endured catastrophic hardship. Villages in the Campinos region filled with refugees, many of them families separated during the earlier bombardments. Accounts describe chaos along the riverbanks, with thousands attempting to cross under fire, livestock stampeding, and carts overturning in the mud. Casualties among civilians rose as German artillery indiscriminately shelled areas suspected of sheltering retreating soldiers. The humanitarian crisis became inseparable from the military struggle. Despite the deteriorating situation, resistance remained fierce. The Podolska and Wielkopolska cavalry brigades launched repeated delaying actions, charging German infantry positions and raiding supply convoys. Though costly, these attacks slowed the pace of the encirclement and allowed portions of the infantry to reach the Campinos forest. In dense woodland, small Polish detachments fought rear-guard battles, using natural cover to ambush German patrols. The adaptability of these units, fighting without clear communication or coordination, testified to the determination to prolong the struggle as long as possible. German commanders noted the stubbornness of this resistance. Reports from the 8th Army described unexpected difficulty in fully sealing the pocket. Some Polish formations broke through German lines in small groups, evading capture and continuing eastward. However, the overall balance was clear. Most divisions of the Poznan and Pomorze armies were exhausted, fragmented, and incapable of sustaining organized operations. By August 18th, the retreat was more a series of scattered movements than a coordinated withdrawal. The improvisation extended even to medical and logistical arrangements. Polish field hospitals, overwhelmed by the scale of casualties, were forced to operate in barns, schools, and roadside clearings. Supplies were improvised from abandoned civilian stocks. Medical personnel often stayed behind with the wounded, knowing they would fall into German hands. Food shortages became acute, with soldiers relying on foraged crops or livestock left behind by fleeing villagers. Despite this, units continued to march, fight, and regroup when possible. Resistance and adaptation during this stage of the battle did not alter the overall outcome, but they did inflict measurable costs on the German side. The Wehrmacht suffered hundreds of additional casualties in close-quarters fighting, and panzer units reported significant vehicle losses from ambushes and mechanical breakdowns in the muddy terrain. These setbacks did not prevent ultimate German success, but they did slow the pace of operations and demonstrated that the Polish counterattack, though doomed, had imposed real strain on the invaders. By the end of this phase, the Polish armies west of the Vistula had largely lost their capacity for organized resistance, yet thousands of soldiers managed to break through into the Campinos forest and continue toward Warsaw, swelling the ranks of the capital's defenders. Others joined partisan detachments, choosing to continue the struggle in irregular fashion. Resistance and adaptation, though unable to reverse the tide, ensured that the Battle of Bzura would not end simply as a German victory, but as a complex struggle in which determination, improvisation, and sacrifice played central roles on both sides. By the third week of September 1939, the Battle of Bzura reached its decisive turning point. The Polish counteroffensive, initially marked by surprise and rapid gains, had been blunted and then encircled by German forces. The moment of decision came as the Wehrmacht shifted from reacting to Polish attacks to systematically dismantling the two armies caught west of Warsaw. German encirclement tactics now dominated the battlefield. Panzer divisions and motorized infantry pressed from multiple directions, while the 8th and 10th Armies closed in from the west and south. The Luftwaffe maintained near total air superiority, flying hundreds of sorties daily. Bombers and Stukas hammered river crossings, troop concentrations, and forested hideouts. Artillery moved forward in large numbers, created constant barrages that sealed off escape routes. For German commanders, the objective was not merely to repel the Polish offensive, but to destroy it completely, eliminating Kutuzeb's and Bortnowski's armies as fighting forces. On the Polish side, the turning point manifested in the collapse of coordinated command. General Kutuzeba still sought to break eastward into the Campino's forest, but his forces were fragmented. Some divisions, such as the 25th Infantry and Wielkopolska Cavalry Brigade, continued fighting in organized formations. Others, cut off and battered by air raids, dissolved into smaller groups acting independently. Orders often arrived too late or not at all. As bridges fell and roads were blocked, retreat became increasingly chaotic. The geography of the battlefield amplified the crisis. The Bzura River, once the launching point of the offensive, now became a trap. Its swollen waters and destroyed crossings trapped thousands of soldiers on the western bank. Attempts to ford under fire often ended in disaster, with men and equipment lost to artillery and aviation. Forests that offered concealment also became pockets of encirclement once German patrols sealed their exits. Villages turned into strong points, briefly holding off attackers before being overrun or abandoned. The critical engagements around Sochachu and Brochov illustrated the turning point. Polish forces launched repeated attempts to pierce the German ring with fierce infantry and cavalry assaults. At Brochov, cavalry brigades attacked against armored and motorized units in an effort to open the corridor to Warsaw. Though briefly successful in pushing German units back, these breakthroughs could not be exploited due to lack of reserves and overwhelming enemy firepower. The Luftwaffe's constant presence broke up concentrations before they could advance further, ensuring that each success was temporary. Civilian suffering reached new extremes. The roads eastward were choked with refugees moving alongside retreating soldiers. German bombers and artillery struck indiscriminately, producing heavy casualties among non-combatants. Entire communities were destroyed as villages became battlegrounds. The humanitarian toll, while not systematically recorded, ran into tens of thousands displaced and untold numbers killed. The Bzura region was left devastated, with infrastructure shattered and fields ruined during harvest season. For German forces, the turning point of the battle reinforced the effectiveness of their operational doctrine. The use of fast-moving armored spearheads, coordinated with air power and supported by artillery, had contained and reversed what had been the largest Polish counterattack of the campaign. The lessons drawn from Bzura confirmed for the Wehrmacht the validity of blitzkrieg methods. Respond to local crises with concentrated force, envelop the enemy rather than engage in prolonged attritional battles, and use mobility to dictate the terms of combat. For the Polish command, the consequences were dire. The opportunity to relieve Warsaw or regroup for further defense slipped away. Instead, Kutuzeb's decision shifted from sustaining the offensive to saving as many troops as possible. This meant abandoning heavy equipment, splitting units into smaller detachments, and attempting night crossings under constant harassment. While some succeeded in reaching the capital, the majority remained trapped. By September 19th to 19th, the decisive shift was complete. German reports indicated that the bulk of the Polish Poznan and Pomor's armies were encircled. Polish units still fought stubbornly in isolated pockets, but the momentum of the counteroffensive was gone. The turning point had arrived, and with it the certainty that the battle's outcome would favor German forces. What remained was the grim process of destruction, capture, and retreat, a tragic conclusion to Poland's boldest attempt at reversing the course of the September campaign. By 19 September 1939, the Battle of Bzura entered its final phase, marked by the collapse of organized Polish resistance and the fragmentation of remaining forces into scattered groups. What had begun as the largest counteroffensive of the September campaign now transitioned into a struggle for survival. German encirclement, coupled with overwhelming air and artillery power, ensured that further offensive action was impossible. The focus for Polish troops became withdrawal, evasion, and the desperate attempt to reach Warsaw or join other surviving units. The encirclement tightened as the 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions cut off escape routes from the west and south, while infantry divisions pressed in from the north. German artillery dominated the battlefield, concentrating on river crossings and forested areas where Polish soldiers attempted to regroup. the Luftwaffe flew continuous sorties, bombarding any concentrations of troops or refugees. The result was devastating. Polish columns moving toward the Vistula were repeatedly broken apart, with thousands killed or captured before reaching safety. Kutrzeba ordered his men to break out toward the Campinos forest and Warsaw in smaller detachments rather than risk annihilation in one mass attempt. Some divisions managed to follow these instructions. Elements of the 15th and 25th Infantry Divisions, along with cavalry from the Podolska and Wielkopolska brigades, succeeded in reaching Warsaw by late September. Their arrival added tens of thousands of men to the defense of the capital, prolonging the city's resistance into early October. However, most units were not as fortunate. The bulk of the Pomor's army, already weakened by earlier defeats, was encircled near Łowicz and Soszachew and forced to surrender after exhausting their ammunition. Casualties during this final stage were immense. Estimates suggest that approximately 20,000 Polish soldiers were killed in the battle, with another 120,000 taken prisoner. German losses were significantly lower, but still notable, with several thousand killed and wounded, particularly in the early days of the counteroffensive. The disparity reflected both the growing imbalance in firepower and the effectiveness of German encirclement tactics, which captured rather than destroyed large numbers of Polish troops. For civilians, the aftermath of the battle brought devastation. Entire towns in the Bzura Valley had been destroyed by artillery and bombing. Refugees caught on the roads during the German advance suffered heavily, with casualties from air raids and shelling adding to the toll. Many survivors were forced into makeshift camps or fled further east, only to encounter Soviet troops advancing after September 17th. Families were separated, farmland was abandoned, and the local economy collapsed under the dual burden of military destruction and occupation. German command considered the destruction of the Polish counteroffensive a decisive achievement. The elimination of the Poznan and Pomor's armies removed a significant portion of Poland's remaining field forces, clearing the way for the encirclement of Warsaw and the final operations of the September campaign. Reports emphasized the effectiveness of coordinated panzer, artillery, and air operations in neutralizing larger numbers of enemy troops. For the Wehrmacht, Bzura became both a demonstration of operational flexibility and a confirmation of the strength of blitzkrieg doctrine. For Poland, however, the immediate consequences were catastrophic. The failure of the counterattack meant that Warsaw and the Modlin fortress were left isolated, dependent on limited reinforcements and supplies. The hope that a large-scale offensive might change the strategic balance or encourage Allied intervention proved unfounded. With the Soviet Union now occupying eastern Poland, the prospect of continuing organized resistance dwindled rapidly. Yet even in defeat, the battle had lasting effects. The diversion of German forces to contain the counteroffensive delayed the siege of Warsaw, allowing the city to prepare its defenses. The courage of Polish soldiers who broke through to the capital bolstered its resistance for several more weeks. Though the immediate result was surrender and imprisonment for most participants, the struggle at Bzura demonstrated the capacity of the Polish army to mount significant operations even under conditions of extreme disadvantage. By the end of September, the battlefield of the Bzura was littered with abandoned equipment, destroyed villages, and mass graves. German troops secured thousands of prisoners, marching them westward into captivity. Survivors who escaped to Warsaw faced another siege, while others melted into the countryside, eventually joining partisan networks. The battle's aftermath underscored both the scale of Polish sacrifice and the futility of continuing conventional warfare against two invading powers. The destruction of the counteroffensive marked the effective end of large-scale Polish military operations in 1939, leaving only isolated centers of resistance as the campaign drew to its close. The Battle of Bzura left an enduring mark on the September campaign of 1939, both in military history and in collective memory. Though it ended in defeat for the Polish forces, its legacy shaped interpretations of the early stages of the Second World War, and continues to be studied as an example of both bold initiative and overwhelming response. Militarily, the battle demonstrated the determination and capability of the Polish army to mount a large-scale counteroffensive even after a series of setbacks. Nearly 150,000 men participated in the operation, making it the largest single battle fought by Poland during the campaign. The offensive temporarily halted the momentum of the German Eighth Army and forced the Wehrmacht to divert armored and air units from other sectors. For several days, German advances toward Warsaw slowed, and the capital gained precious time to strengthen its defenses. These tactical achievements, however, were outweighed by the ultimate destruction of the Poznan and Pomorze armies. From the German perspective, Bzura validated operational methods that had been developed during the interwar years. The ability to react quickly to a local crisis by redeploying panzer divisions and concentrating the Luftwaffe proved decisive. Encirclement, combined arms coordination, and the systematic targeting of enemy logistics became hallmarks of blitzkrieg doctrine. German commanders studied the battle afterward as an example of how to neutralize large enemy forces through speed and concentration, rather than prolonged attrition. For Polish commanders, the lessons were sobering. Kutrzeba's counteroffensive was bold and initially successful, but it lacked the logistical support, mechanization, and air cover needed to sustain momentum. Communications difficulties, limited supplies, and reliance on horse-drawn transport hindered the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The experience reinforced the vulnerability of a largely infantry-based army against a modern, mechanized opponent. At the same time, the battle demonstrated the potential value of local counterattacks, which inflicted real costs on the enemy and delayed their advance. The political significance of the battle was equally complex. Internationally, news of the Polish counteroffensive was noted in Britain and France, but it did not alter Allied strategy. The Western Allies remained inactive on the Western Front, launching only symbolic operations that did not relieve pressure on Poland. For Polish leaders, the battle underscored the reality of fighting largely in isolation. With the Soviet invasion beginning on September 17th, the broader strategic situation became untenable regardless of events at the Bzura. For civilians, the legacy was one of devastation. The region around Wołycz, Soshachev, and the Bzura River was left in ruins. Villages were destroyed, harvests abandoned, and tens of thousands displaced. The humanitarian impact was immediate and long-lasting, with survivors facing occupation, imprisonment, or exile. The suffering of civilians became a central part of how the battle was remembered in local communities long after the war ended. In the decades that followed, the Battle of Bzura became a subject of commemoration in Poland. Monuments were erected in the towns and villages where the fighting had occurred, and the memory of soldiers who fought and fell there was preserved in military histories and local traditions. Kutrzeba himself, though ultimately unsuccessful, was often recognized for his initiative and his attempt to alter the course of the campaign. For many Poles, the battle symbolized both the possibilities of resistance and the overwhelming odds faced by their country in September 1939. Historians continue to debate the broader significance of the counteroffensive. Some emphasize its role in delaying German operations and prolonging the defense of Warsaw. Others highlight the risks it entailed, drawing resources away from coordinated national defense and leading to the destruction of two entire armies. Yet most agree that the battle exemplified the tension between tactical success and strategic failure, showing how determined action at the operational level could not overcome fundamental imbalances of power. Ultimately, the Battle of Bzura occupies a distinct place in the narrative of the Second World War. It was Poland's largest and most ambitious attempt to resist the German invasion on open ground, and although it ended in defeat, it demonstrated that the Polish army was capable of mounting significant resistance under adverse conditions. For Germany, it reinforced confidence in new methods of warfare that would soon be tested on a larger scale in Western Europe. For Poland, it became both a tragic loss and a symbol of resistance, remembered not only for its outcome, but for the determination it represented in the face of overwhelming force.